Hello guys, hello everyone. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure today and welcome you all to this exciting event. My name is Wisely Wong. I'm the Business Director of Pace Hong Kong and the MC for today. I'm delighted to see so many business individuals here thriving, looking forward to the economy, such fast-paced economy. And again, thank you all for your tremendous support. There are a lot of new faces and old friends, and I look forward to connecting with you afterwards in our networking section. Before moving onward, just a couple of kind reminders. This is a hybrid event with attendees online joining us across Asia. This event shall be recorded. Again, please remind to turn off your phones or into silent mode. For our agenda today, we have a great lineup of speakers who provide valuable insights into the latest macroeconomics and market trends in Asia and Hong Kong. Today's agenda will begin with Mr. Edward Chui's presentation on Asia and Hong Kong's economic outlook, followed by Ms. Su Wei's presentation about the Asia and Hong Kong talent and salary trends. There will be a Q&A section afterwards, where members of the audiences or virtual chat box will be given a chance to ask questions. I've also selected a couple of questions from the RSVP list earlier. We're aiming to end the Q&A session at approximately 3:45, which will then be followed by a networking section with drinks and snacks over there. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce Mr. Edward Chui, the Director of the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network in Hong Kong. Edward is an expert in macroeconomics with over a decade of experiences advising business and navigating the complexities of the global economy. Today, he will share his insights with us, and I promise it will be engaging and insightful. So please pay close attention to the presentation and his analysis. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Edward Chui onto the stage.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that kind introduction. I wish it were just a decade. It's actually a couple of decades at least, but I do appreciate that. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. I'm still getting used to the idea of in-person events, especially ones that are maskless. So it's always a pleasure to see an in-person room full of attendees. And thank you to those online as well. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today. I'll be presenting a global macroeconomic perspective on what's going on today, with an emphasis on the Asia-Pacific region, and then go a little more granular into China, Greater China, and especially Hong Kong. So I usually like to start off these presentations with a quote, which I feel is very apt with regards to what's transpired and what's going on in the world today. It's a quote by Lenin. There are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And it seems much more true today than it does in years past, especially with what's going on in the world. So I would say for Hong Kong specifically, despite the enthusiasm of the past month and a half, we've had a lot of in-person mega events from Art Basel, the sporting events like the Sevens. We've had terrific arts and music and cultural events, including Clockenflap and Creamfields, for example. It's still a time of great challenge. It's a time of reinvention. It's a reset for all intents and purposes, especially with what this city has gone through, what this region has gone through over the past few years, and much more so in Hong Kong, going back to even 2019. So it's a time to work together, and the future rests certainly on the shoulders of a number of different parties and factors. I'd like to start off with a visual. As part of the Economist Group, we also have the magazine, which most of you are probably more familiar with. And so these are covers from this year and the past year, and these sort of indicate some of the more sort of common themes that we're looking at for the year ahead. Some of the larger ones that have sort of shaped the global conversation. So you can see that we're looking at the implication for the war in the Ukraine, how that's affected regional and global supply chains, and what that's meant for businesses. We see the influence of rising inflation and how U.S. regional and global banks especially have had to deal with higher interest rates, and how corporate executives who've never had to deal with an era of high interest rates are now having to deal with that. And we've seen the sort of knock-on effects of that Certainly more recently with regional banks like SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature. We've seen Credit Suisse and certain other insolvencies not being able to sort of manage this era of high interest rates in the best possible way. We've seen aggressive monetary policy from central banks, especially the Fed in the US. And we're also looking at, the big story of the year is probably, continues to be China. Whether it's its pivot away from zero COVID, whether it's policies coming out of 20th Party in 2 sessions dealing with its domestic economy, coming off the back of 3.5% last year and going into about 5.5% this year GDP. So this is just sort of a visualization of the larger things we're looking at. So let's take a step back. Oh, one thing I wanted to sort of preface this with is that there's a lot of information on these slides. So don't feel like you need to sort of read through all of it while simultaneously listen. I'm going to just sort of create a narrative for you to understand what's going on in the world today. And I've been told that should you want a copy of this deck, please feel free to reach out to your Hayes representative and they'll send you a copy of it so that you can look at it more granularly later on. So as I said earlier, this chart, we're just sort of taking a step back and seeing where we are today in terms of some of the major themes. So there are 5 areas that are a bit more optimistic than we've been expecting for the global economy, especially if you've heard us espouse what was going to happen in the world last November. It was certainly a lot more negative then going into the winter than it is today. The global economy has been relatively resilient. We're not expecting recessions in the US or the EU this year. I would say the second theme, and a little bit more difficult, is the idea of inflation, which is not going away anytime quickly. It's certainly coming down from its high levels that we saw at the end of last year. In the US, I think it's posted its 9th consecutive decrease. It just came in at 5% for March, down from 6% in February. But despite that, interest rates are going to remain high. So that means pressures on markets. It means pressure on funding, and it means a higher cost of capital to consider, especially for key decision makers. Another key trend is consumer goods and consumers. People are spending again. Labor markets in the US and Europe have been pretty robust with high levels of employment, high levels of wage growth. So households have been very willing to spend to stave off global recessionary fears, more so than had been earlier anticipated. Consumption is a little bit weaker in Asia, but we're going to have some level of rebound. And we've started to see that as a result of China's reopening. Just yesterday, I think the Q1 numbers for China came in at 4.5%, better than expected. I think people had anticipated about 4%. So that's sort of been put on a more accelerated track than we had anticipated as well. Another trend is, so with China and the US, geopolitics is always going to play a big role, and it's going to be a big item on our agenda. So the perspective that we're looking at is more from the idea of protectionism, whether it's in the name of national security or ideology or even decoupling. It's certainly something that we're going to see play out in terms of policy measures, trade restrictions, tariffs, etc. So geopolitics is a driver of those things, including the weaponization of finance or technology. We're seeing daily in media, new restrictions on social media, sophisticated technology, and that's all driven again, as I said, by geopolitics. So the last one is, of course, China, the return of China. And you certainly can't talk about Hong Kong or the region without acknowledging the outside effect of China generally and its reopening and sort of the differentiation in terms of narrative this year relative to the past 3 years. So generally with these types of presentations being from the economists, we talk about macroeconomic perspectives and numbers, but we can't really talk about that without understanding geopolitics and how that's dominated the headlines and how that's had an outsized effect on macroeconomic indicators. Certainly, as the role of multinational companies has evolved over time, you can't operate in a vacuum because what's influencing macroeconomic trends has a lot to do with what's happening geopolitically. So, this heat map shows some of the risks that we're keeping an eye on and that we're sort of concerned with on a going forward basis. I've touched upon a few briefly, but the more pressing ones include, as I said, the risks of global monetary policy as driven by central banks. We've got the ongoing Ukraine conflict, and that's going to also have an outsized effect. Just to give you an indication, just last year, the war in Ukraine shaved some $1 trillion off of the global GDP. That's the size of the economy of Italy, for example, just sort of being wiped off. And so that's going to, continue on for, we expect, in the next, 4 to 5 years. There are a number of possible outcomes that could result from that, but it's going to be ongoing. We see for at least the next few years. We see clearly U.S.-Sino relations, deterioration of that and what the effects of that are. I'll go into that in a little bit later. NATO expansion, and if you sort of look ahead, in terms of events that could sort of have positive or negative effect, but an outsized effect. We've got the U.S. presidential elections going into 2024. Other areas include extreme weather events, that certainly disrupt commodities and lead to price spikes. This leads to food insecurity, higher inflation, social unrest, cyber war concerns. So a lot to keep an eye on. So not to sort of bring the room down, but these are certainly concerns that we should be cognizant of. So this is a little bit of a controversial headline, but could the U.S.-China rivalry derail the Asian century, what we've been experiencing for the past couple of decades? So it seems like a bold statement, but you do hear lots of talk about decoupling and bifurcation. There's some at the moment, $650 billion worth of trade between the U.S. and China. So there would be a huge, economic dislocation should that sort of, disappear overnight. So there's no concern of that really happening in that capacity anytime soon. It's somewhat unrealistic because they are so interlaced, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on, especially as the rhetoric gets ramped up and has been certainly over last year and in the foreseeable future as well. I do think, despite that, the concern is this idea of, from a business perspective, the idea of the creation of business blocks or competitive blocks, the unwinding of trade or supply chains, a type of systematic bipolarity, if you will. This pressure to choose sides, especially in this part of the world. What you've seen is that a lot of countries have really benefited from either the protectionism from the US or the economic prosperity that they've achieved by aligning themselves with China. And so as you see this sort of separations, tensions build between US and China, the countries, globally, but especially in this part of the world, are looking to sort of, ride the fence between the two, but it's going to increasingly become more difficult to do so. So it's almost an impossible choice to, choose between protectionism or economic prosperity. But that's something that is something that's going to weigh on their minds. Ultimately, there's that pressure to choose, and this would ultimately lead to separate supply chains, inputs, potential tariffs, and increased inefficiencies and higher costs as a result. So moving on to the economic outlook for the world, Asia, and China. This colorful chart is our growth map. So if you look, the red countries are the ones that are growing faster. The blue economies are the ones that are growing a little more slowly. Overall, the global growth rate is actually going to be about 2%, a little more optimistic again than we had about 6 months ago. I think 6 months ago, we've increased our forecast about 25% in terms of global growth rate. To put things in perspective, 3% is, in a normal year, what's expected. So 2%, it's not great, it's not ideal, but it's certainly far from 0% or the fears of sort of a global recession that we had sort of played along with about 6 months ago. It's certainly far from zero. The mood music globally that we're hearing from businesses is weaker than what we're seeing in terms of the fundamentals. So slightly more optimistic picture than I think people's sentiment might convey. There's a lot of blue in Europe. That's where growth is the slowest in the year ahead. Two key things that have helped raise our global growth forecast since the end of last year. One was the sudden pivot away from zero COVID from China, so the reopening of the biggest market in the world. certainly, and then also relatively warm winter in Europe, which has sort of helped in terms of the reliance on energy and sort of bringing inflation down in that capacity. So after years kind of unpleasant news, it's sort of nice to have a little more positivity in our forecasts. But there continue to be some challenges, and you see some dark blues. We're not expecting widespread recessions, like I said, at least through to the end of this year. In the US, growth is now just at around 1%. US wages and wage growth and employment continue to surprise on the upside. So that's good news for the real economy. Asia is still a growth region. It was a decade ago during the last great sort of recessionary period that we had, and will continue to be so, I would say, in the next decade or so at least. Sub-Saharan Africa, on a very long-term going forward basis, is a sort of trendy hotspot growth area, but that won't happen for, again, at least sort of the next decade. That's something to sort of keep an eye on. There are a lot more positive growth stories out there. You see a lot of diversity, especially in the lower right-hand segment of this growth map. It's not universally good for all emerging markets. It's still selective, but certainly a more positive outlook than we had before. A quick word on inflation. This is a chart of some of the major economies. China is in light blue. Asia is a little less affected by commodity price inflation than the rest of the world, primarily because it's not as exposed to the price of energy, the price of gas. US inflation was at 5%, just announced recently. Its smallest increase in 2 years. So we do see inflation having peaked from end of last year and is certainly falling. We'd love to see it fall faster, but it's certainly looking to come down to what central banks are comfortable with by the end of the year. Again, as I mentioned, sort of 9 consecutive months of it having come down. So as inflation continues to recede incrementally, it's still not going to get down to the levels, even by 2024, of what the typical target rates are for most G20 countries at around 2%, which is what their ultimate goal is. We do expect it at around 3.5%. So, we're at 5% now. So 3.5% by the end of this year is sort of the target outlook for inflation. But we do have to get used to relatively higher rates as a result. And when inflation comes down, interest rates won't be coming down to sort of the 0.5% environment that we were used to since about 2009. Those days are seemingly over. So planning for the longer term for this higher cost of capital is important for business managers. In some sectors, in terms of tech, VC, PE, for example, they're going to be particularly affected by that higher cost of capital environment. Yeah. Sorry, it was this chart. And then I'll just talk about exchange rates. So US dollar strength is waning relative to its peak from last year. Volatility remains elevated. It will continue to depreciate modestly, we feel, as the Fed slows and eventually pauses its monetary tightening. The Eurozone maintains a bleak economic outlook for the remainder of this year due to its deteriorating terms of trade and persistent interest rate differential with the US. And that'll continue to weigh on the euro. Sterling will remain under pressure against the dollar until inflation eases and the UK's terms of trade improve. And in this part of the world, China and Japan, with its more accommodative monetary policies, will use market interventions to cushion the depreciation and soften that effect of their currencies against the dollar. So volatility in most emerging market currencies will continue. Weakness against the dollar will also persist as they face capital outflows and rising balance of payments. So this is just sort of a better visualization of what I just mentioned in terms of especially the basket of currencies that you find in this part of the region in Asia Pacific. Surging prices for commodity exports and higher interest rates clearly will play into the level of volatility that you see more on the middle to the right part of the chart. But recovery is underway for most currencies, especially central banks continue to hike and narrow the interest rate differential. So on a more regional basis, the big story, I would say, is consumer spending and private consumption. So goods and consumers are going to be the biggest drivers for Asia growth across the board in the year ahead. That's the dark blue part of this chart. So for each country, there's last year, and this year, last year on the left, and this year on the right. So in Asia Pacific, there are three major economies which are going to benefit from private consumption the most in terms of higher growth rate, and that includes China, Hong Kong, and Thailand, actually. And that's due in large part due to because of tourism. Tourism in Hong Kong, for example, comprised about 5% of total GDP. So it's an important factor because there are a lot of peripheral effects, but not the biggest driver, but unlike places like Thailand. So given the baseline of Chinese consumption is pretty low, given what happened last year with on-off lockdowns, we can certainly get excited about the growth rate, especially when compared to last year. Also, private consumption will be coming mostly from households, and this is true for China especially. I would say that for the next decade, investment will be strong in more strategic industries as a result of geopolitics, things like electric vehicles, batteries, semiconductors, renewable energy, AI. These are the drivers of growth in terms of the digital economy and digital transformation for a lot of these countries. The next two slides, I'm going to just go to quickly, just because of time, but it talks about China's reopening, what to expect in terms of revenge spend. While numbers for China, as I mentioned just yesterday, came in at about 4.5%, that's due in part to a lot of pent-up demand, a lot of accumulated savings that we had seen. It doesn't necessarily mask underlying weakness in terms of high unemployment, especially among a younger demographic. What you see in terms of the 16 to 24% demo in China, it's gone up from about 18 to now close to 20, I think 19.6, close to 20%. 1 in 5 are unemployed, and that's going to become increasingly more challenging as university graduates come online later on this quarter. So there continues to be some apprehension and a lack of confidence, despite what should be a euphoric period coming out of sort of these flip-flopping policies and lockdown, et cetera. But the slowdown in property, et cetera, these things have continued to sort of play a role. Let me just talk about Hong Kong quickly. The outlook for Hong Kong, thankfully, a little more positive than we've seen in the past on a relative basis. So we had negative growth at about 3.5% negative growth GDP last year. We're looking at 3.4%. I've seen estimates as high as 5.5%. I think that's a bit too optimistic for this year, but the narrative is certainly more positive than it has been, especially over the past few years. There was a rebound year in 2021, but despite that, I think it's been sort of somewhat negative sentiment. But we have a lot of stuff to look forward to. Household spending, as mentioned, is also a big factor, especially in Hong Kong, certainly more positive. The government has certainly made an effort to promote itself with regards to green technology, ongoing as a finance center, as an international finance hub, looking to attract specialized labor and capital as a priority. Ultimately, Hong Kong will continue to benefit from China's economic recovery and the rising internationalization of the renminbi. Looking to attract specialized labor in high-end sectors, similar to what I just mentioned in China in terms of green energy, in terms of AI, in terms of sort of new digital technologies. Looking to get investment and working with different regions, including the Middle East, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. These recent trips where CE John Lee went with an entourage of business leaders. For example, talking to Saudi oil giant Aramco, looking to list in Hong Kong potentially. They signed an MOU. So having them come on board here would certainly increase the credibility and visibility of Hong Kong and maintain its status as sort of financial hub. Financial and let's see, benefit. Right. So this continues with the story of rejuvenation coming out of zero COVID. It's almost a tale of two cities. Just the past 2 months alone, we saw in March with the dropping of the final zero COVID restriction, with the dropping of the mask mandate, and then the sort of slew of really great mega international events, as I mentioned before. But then you've got, Qingming and Easter holiday, where about 12% of the local Hong Kong population left the city, and the numbers coming in from the mainland didn't necessarily come up to expectations. So, hopefully the momentum from, March carries through to the remainder of the year. But there remains positive sentiment, certainly, but there still needs to be a lot of work done. It's not going to be automatic. There needs to be sort of a new paradigm shift in the way it presents itself to the world. Certainly, Hong Kong is not going to go back to its heady days of 2018, or at least in terms of its identity and personality. And so it needs to sort of reinvent itself in that capacity. I will leave this to Sue to talk about sort of the gulf between employee and employer expectations. But I will end the presentation on these last couple of slides. And just to emphasize this idea that while we're sort of focused on Hong Kong, we have to take into account sort of the geopolitical landscapes of the region, of the world. FDI is a good indicator of that. So while businesses aren't necessarily, and this is a generalization, but aren't necessarily divesting per se, or investing as much into China, they're moving those funds to other areas. And the beneficiaries of that include Southeast Asia, South Asia, and this is a result of the sort of China +1, +2 strategies. Due to sort of the closing of the markets in terms of the borders for China, Hong Kong also, this idea that they needed, these on-off lockdowns, this idea that they needed to hedge their bets and diversify their production bases elsewhere, allowed for places like Vietnam, Indonesia, India especially, to be the beneficiary of that. And you see, for example, I think more recently, Tim Cook from Apple is in India, opening its first 2 retail stores there, but also looking at the idea that, by 2025, publicly proclaiming that about 25% of iPhones will move from China to India. 20% of iPads and iWatches will move from China to places like Vietnam. So this idea of sort of moving abroad, away from China, and the idea that geopolitics is playing a role in that, is sort of a fundamental idea to sort of keep an eye on when you look at the region, when you look at China, and when you look at also the effects it has on places like Hong Kong, through its close association with China as well. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, sort of this gradual decoupling between the West and China is already part of our forecast, our core forecast. It doesn't necessarily mean an end of trade, but it does mean an increase in the level of barriers and an increase in political risk on both sides of the fence. So I would say for the final slide, this idea that things are tough now, but if you look sort of on a longer term basis, this chart goes through to about 2050. These are sort of longer term trends to sort of understand directionally where a lot of these countries, a lot of these larger economies, small and medium sized economies are sort of playing against each other. So we do see, for example, China being the top economy sometime in the next decade, in the early to mid 2030s. We see India moving up to 3rd ranking, and some of the more established economies in Europe, for example, are going to maintain its status or move down. But I think to keep an eye on, especially you see a lot of these APAC countries in these red boxes. A lot of them are sort of moving up the chart and sort of reinventing its economy, taking advantage of increased FDI and its status as sort of manufacturing hubs, and moving up the rankings on a longer term basis. And a lot of it driven by digital innovation and transformation, and the idea that a lot of these sort of new industries are what's going to be the drivers of that. So with that, thank you so much. I hope you found that insightful.
Thank you, Ed. I'm very happy, with such information. There's a lot of information in the slides. A refreshment that the world is back on shape. I actually feel more optimistic after listening to this. Now we have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Ms. Sue Wei, the Managing Director of ACE Hong Kong. Sue is a highly respected executive across recruitment with 13 years of experiences in China and Hong Kong. She's currently managing around 100 staff in Hong Kong business and will share her analysis across the job trend, market, and salary trend within Asia and Hong Kong. Please join me in welcoming Sue onto the stage.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for that, Edward. I think, again, it feels like Hong Kong is coming back. Thank you for the backdrop of what's happening in the world. Now, let's talk about Asia and how that actually impacts us. So I'm going to talk about I'm not going to go through this because most of you guys are Hayes guests, but obviously, we are a recruitment business that has been around for a long time. And what I'm going to talk about really is about the employment trends. So this is the launch of our Hayes Asia salary guide. This is a guide that's our 16th edition. We do this annually, usually at the end of the year, so 2022, to really give a bit of an understanding of what's going to happen in 2023. So this is an outlook of what will happen this year. I'm going to start with a little bit about Asia because, again, we don't live in isolation. Everything that happens across Asia will impact us in Hong Kong. So it is an optimistic year. Congratulations. 2023, employers that we've surveyed, over 10,000, have told us that they are actually keen to hire. In comparison to 2022, it's about 48% of our employers that says that they're going to increase their employment of permanent headcounts, as opposed to 44% last year. Of course, those regions do reflect differences. What we see is actually Japan. They're more optimistic and they're hiring a lot more. Employers are also confident that they're actually able to find the talent that they need in this market. So again, 64% of employers in Asia says, in comparison to last year, that they're more confident about finding the people that we need. Again, we have a lot of HR experts in this room, so I think that's good news. Although later on, I will talk through about Hong Kong, which does paint a little bit of a different picture. Salary. So what are salary increases going to be like? So the good news is most employers are expecting to give some sort of increase to their employees. This is just for employees that you expect to stay. So this is an annual increase, not about moving jobs where we would expect to have much higher salary increases. Across Asia, it seems to be that around 3 to 6% is the norm. Japan and Hong Kong, however, looks to be under 3%. So most employers are saying they're only willing to pay less than 3% for their employees. And then about active job seekers. So the issue here is that we have only, if you look across Asia and if you look at Hong Kong, 82% of the people that say they are open to opportunities. So I'm okay if you call me up and offer me a job. However, of that percentage, only 28.5% of people are actively looking. That means the traditional way of putting up an ad and hoping that somebody applies to your role doesn't work. You need to be more aggressive, more active about finding those inactive candidates. So they're the ones that are waiting for you to knock on their door to come. Work-life balance and flexibility. So money is still the main factor, but those are the other things that people are looking for when they want to stay in jobs and when they want to go. So if you can't offer the money of more than that 3-6% increases, can you as employers offer something else? Or as employees as well? Is the money giving you more work-life balance? We're talking about nowadays 4-day work weeks, work from home, work anywhere in the world. Can those things compensate for the lack of salary? And it sounds like it can. And then sustainability. I know a lot of us have talked about it. Sustainability, ESG is a big topic today, of the day, but what it is it's also an attraction for employers. When you have lots of competition trying to hire the same talents, how can you differentiate your employer proposition? ESG, commitment to sustainability, commitment to D&E&I, those are ways that you could potentially differentiate to attract, especially Gen Z. So Hong Kong, this is where we live, and this is where we want to know how is it going to affect us. So again, the positive news is that for Hong Kong, business activities are expected to increase in comparison to last year. Most companies, 44% in comparison to last year, are expecting to increase their staff. 86% of these guys are willing to use a recruitment agency like Hayes. And only 18% of employers are saying they're expecting to decrease the business activities. So this is a little bit different. So for Hong Kong, especially those that have seen the changes and that have lived here during the last couple of years, we've seen an exodus of talent. And our surveyors have told us that 30% of the people are still looking to move overseas. That means we will be losing those potential talents. 82% of those people, again, that said they're looking for jobs, only 28% of those people are actively looking. Of the companies that they're looking for, international companies still remain top. However, domestic and Asian companies are now increasingly a chance priority as well. And again, top motivations for job, we're no different from the rest of Asia. We still want the money. That said, better benefits, challenges, work-life balance, flexibility. Those are things that you can work into your attraction of jobs when you're looking for talent. So this one, the main takeaway, I know it's very complicated, is that, again, in Hong Kong, employers only want to pay less than 3% annual increases. The good news is employers are willing to pay more in terms of, well, they're willing to pay bonuses. So 88% of employers are paying some sort of bonus this year, as opposed to 65% last year. The biggest gap in the issue here is that employees are expecting more. Majority of employees want more than 6%. So there's the gap. If you can't close off the gap, then your candidates might go elsewhere. Your current employees might go to your competitors. This is about the skills. So hiring skills talent. 61% are confident about hiring skills talents. So this is actually a different picture from Asia, because while most of Asia feel that 2023 is the year they're actually more confident about finding the skills that they can, that they need, Hong Kong is the reverse story. Again, that probably has to do with the survey of talents going elsewhere. Top reasons for the skills shortage. Again, people can offer better money. Bit of lack of learning and development for current employees. And then some skills are just too niche and hard to source in the current market. We'll go through some of the key industries and functions that are in high demand later on. And again, this shows that professionals in Hong Kong feels that they're they're missing the skills that they need. The good news is most people seem to spend some time, so 62% of the people do spend some time upskilling themselves, either through company or through self-initiatives. Funny enough, Hong Kong employees do think that they have some sort of work-life balance. It's actually 42% says average, 30% is good, and 11 says very good. So something has changed across the years, probably because of, again, all the COVID restrictions. So potentially most companies have embraced some sort of flexible working that allows for better work-life balance. Hong Kong employees also think it's important that companies do have some sort of sustainable commitment a commitment to some sort of sustainable future. This is again a way to differentiate, especially surveys being done about Gen Zs. Gen Zs not only want companies that they don't necessarily just want the title, the brand of a company, they care about the value proposition of that company. Does it align with my own? So here I'm going to go through again a few key sectors. Again, Hays, we cover about 14 different sectors and functions. Given time, the full report will have every single one. But I'm going to only go through a couple of the key ones today. So accountancy and finance, this is actually hard to see. What we're seeing is that larger organizations are actually focused more on succession planning. So instead of hiring very senior roles externally, they may focus on actually growing their own talent internally. Obviously, we're going through a great deal of digitalization within the accounting and finance sectors and trying to automate a number of roles. That will change, again, the type of roles that we'll be looking for in the future. And lots of talks about sustainability, ESG, reporting, everything that's now changed because of government expectations. So again, very vague at the moment in terms of actual requirements for listed companies. However, this will be the new future of accounting and finance. Banking, again, we are seeing actually a lot of new drivers of headcounts in that areas in compliance, AML, again, driven mostly by regulatory changes. We do see, again, increased job demands in areas such as control functions and in private banks. And this talk about this family office, wealth management, again, Hong Kong, we're trying to compete with a number of areas such as Singapore to bring them in. This will also mean that we need those talents in those areas. HR. So what is needed and in high demand now in HR? Any roles that has to do with some sort of system. So HRIS experts are in need. Transformation, whichever type of talents in that space for different transformation projects that companies are going through. Talent acquisition. Remember that we actually need to hire those talents back now. So for the last couple of years, talent acquisition, especially during COVID, those are probably roles that were let go. Now we need them back so that we can actually actively attract and hire people. Again, such a competition for talent that companies are trying to streamline and accelerate their interviewing processes to ensure that their candidate doesn't go. The very hard to find candidate that is finally willing to move and stay in Hong Kong comes to you. Insurance. So I think we have quite a few from the sector here. Insurance is coming back, it's booming. So a lot of the focus during COVID was on digitalization. That will continue to go on. But there is a bit of caution about growth despite the border opening, but it does feel like it's a very optimistic industry. Persistent hiring across almost every single job function that you see in insurance. And again, talent short. So those candidates, we need to find them somewhere. Technology. So technology talents are hard to find. So anyone that works in HR knows that we don't have those tech. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not technology, that's legal. Apologies. So legal, we do see a bit of a slowdown in terms of legal talents needs in Hong Kong. However, areas such as lawyers that are in the new space, so lawyers that are in technology, data privacy, as well as funds, that those areas will continue to be an area of demand. Life sciences. Again, pharmaceutical and R&D firms, especially in the oncology space, they need those talents and they don't exist in Hong Kong. So a lot of the focus is actually now on overseas, bringing those talents to Hong Kong. So you see roles for R&D scientists, laboratory, medical affairs, commercial position across pharmaceutical and medical device. And this is the two industry that actually has very high margins and they can pay the best. So these are the companies that can pay over normal average. So if you expect a person to move a job in Hong Kong, you can expect a 20% increase on their pay for them to move. In this area, you can expect to pay over 30%. Marketing and digital, again, skills shortage. We do have, again, those roles that are systems related, CRMs, anything to do with data. Those are roles that are very difficult to find. We have seen some talents that were in the original sort of that crypto blockchain space has kind of moved to more traditional industries. This may change, but again, we do not have the talent readily available in Hong Kong. Consumer and services, clearly with the return of tourism, this is an area that we are expecting to see increase again. So those are talents, especially the ones that were in travel, hospitality, leisure. Those are areas that companies are now finding it very hard to find candidates that potentially have moved to another industry during the last couple of years to bring them back in. Supply chain. So the word about supply chain now is actually about sustainable supply chain. As companies, again, through COVID, they needed to find talents. So procurement supply chain talents during COVID was sort of on pause a bit in Hong Kong. Now, as the border opens, as companies need to look for a China plus one, they need to dig and look for these talents. Again, because most of those talents have left or they've moved. Those are all jobs in our technology space that, again, the government has done a great deal in terms of talent schemes, GBAs, trying to get those talents mostly from mainland China. However, it's able to close off some of the gaps, but it's not necessarily enough just yet. We do need to work both with universities as well as with government to ensure that we can attract and grow and develop our own talent in Hong Kong. So, recommendations. It's hard to find those talents, yes, and the news will be, everyone will be wanting to do the same things. How do you retain? How do you attract? So some of the recommendations that we give to our clients are this. Compensation. Don't lowball your candidates. Even if they accept that salary now, they might not remain because they were able to find that role somewhere else. Ensure, again, the talk of town is about equity, fairness, inclusion, green work environment. This is a way to differentiate your company and increase your own value proposition as an employer. You do need to move more quickly than you have done in the past with good candidates because the processes of 6 to 8 different rounds of interviews may mean you lose your candidate halfway. The positive employment experience is also important as well. So in the past, this is not necessarily something that is forefront of HR and line managers, but you do need to give your candidate a better experience. Not only does it affect your reputation in the long run, but it does actually affect whether they then take the job with you. Upskilling. So most of the talents you can find potentially by buying them off of your competitors or trying to import them from overseas. But you do also need to spend time to upskill your own employees because that is how you will retain them. Flexible working solutions. Surprisingly, our data shows that over 40% of employers in Hong Kong actually still request that their employees work on-site permanently, which I was very surprised about, especially since COVID. I had assumed that most companies had offered some sort of work-life balance in terms of offering them flexibilities of working out. But this is something that employees are now looking for and they're used to. So benefits as well. So that flexible benefits is also an important one for companies. as a way, again, in the past, insurance benefits, medical benefits, for example, might be offered as a one package for all, but actually a lot of companies are now realizing that different cohorts of people, they have different needs, and this is a way to address and attract different types of people. Contracting solutions, if your company cannot find that talent right away, or you don't have the permanent headcount that you need to hire, contracting is a solution, and this is one of the areas in Hays that we've been growing through our contracting solution by having those employees join your company for a fixed 6 to 1 year contract, and then potentially moving them into a full time employee at a later date as the trial. Encouraging department or location transfers, we're seeing this a lot more now. So a lot of companies have actually offered, for example, employees in their company to work anywhere within their organization as a way of retention. Or actually, we do get employers that when they hire, they can hire and go, we don't mind where the candidate is based. It could be Singapore, it could be Hong Kong. We are open as long as that candidate is the talent that we need. And this is a great way, honestly, to attract and actually stop yourself from fixating on a single location. Of course, partner with a strong recruitment agency that can tell you what is exactly happening in market. For employees too, because most of us at some point in our time will be looking for jobs as well. So what should we recommend? So job security and progression, career progression is the main reason. People don't always stay just for money. They need other things. Job security, especially in such uncertain times, is actually one of the most important factors for people. We also recommend our candidates to find the right window to make your move. So don't always move for the money and don't keep moving. You need to plan for a long-term career. We do have candidates, for example, in a 10-year career that may have moved 8 times. So it's great for short-term salary, title increases, but what it does is it damages your CV in the long run, because companies are not willing to trust that this person will be a long-term investment. Should I invest and train you so that you can go somewhere else? And then again, this I keep harping on is about the non-financial benefits. When you are paid less than you're expected, can you negotiate for other things? Can you negotiate potentially for those flexible benefits? So medical benefits that may affect, may be better suited for you, or could you negotiate to work somewhere else? Those are all things that you can take into consideration. And when you really think about the real time versus that you put in for the money, potentially it might be a better deal than say that 2% extra. Developing the right competence. Again, we do see that Hong Kong employees actually do spend a lot of time upskilling themselves. But the issue is, are you upskilling yourselves in the right skill sets? Are you spending your time and your money to get trained on things that the market needs? That's quite important. Of course, always develop your soft skills as well as your technical skills. And of course, lastly, and most importantly, you need to talk to the right vendors. You need to understand your own value to market, as well as potentially what you might be missing in your career, and use that as a way to look for jobs in the market rather than simply jump for a simple job or a simple salary increase. So this one is, I put that up there really just to say, these are the things that we see could impact the world, the future world of work. So what exactly will AI do to jobs of today? We don't know. What is sustainability in the green economy? Does that actually change every single job in this room? We have talent scarcity, and the upskilling of talent will be the new headache for Hong Kong especially, but of course anywhere else in the world. So what do we do about that? Mental health and well-being, work-life balance and work flexibilities, those are all topics of the day. So the workforce of the future don't just care about money. It's a lot of other things. So I'm just putting that up there as a slide to say, we don't know what's coming. We can only keep, I guess, discussing and surveying and understanding from our clients and candidates, and ensure that, again, your skill sets evolve to the point where, regardless of what happens to the market, as well as what happens to demands, you will be in demand.